My name is Paul, and this is my video out. Fun.
I love
dun,
that.
dun, dun. I'm Paul Morejo. I'm a photographer, and I was born and raised in Harlem and then moved to the South Bronx when I was about high school age. And the experience of growing up gay in the 80s, which was a long time ago, but it was definitely still New York, and it was a different experience for me, just because there was a lot more shame and a lot more kind of less out experiences to kind of take part of. So I really didn't come out till I was probably like 22, maybe 23, when I moved to LA. But in Harlem, in the Bronx, it was just being aware that I was different, but also being aware that it wasn't safe to be myself. So I had to figure out how to manage that. And so it was, it was definitely challenging. I knew kids who were out, and I thought they were the bravest people in the world because they were who they were, and they were still, even though they got made fun of, even though they were jokes, even though they were like high school gags, pranks, they were fiercely defending their space to be there, and I thought that was amazing. Well, I mean, raised Catholic, parents were both Catholic, and it just didn't fit into like what I was told, who I was told I would be, and that was really kind of programming that I didn't ask for, but that's what happens when you don't have other options. You just kind of, and you what's the word? You absorb the culture that you're given, and if you don't find the culture you need, then you're kind of, you don't have bearings. And that's kind of where we were. So now I'm just grateful that like there's more cultures out there kind of, represented and places you can take part of, and it's not the same like it was. It's actually like, the diversity and like expression of identity and sexuality and just being yourself is fascinating now because, there's so many kind of iterations and fluidity. And so, and back then in the 80s, 90s, it was, you were either straight or you were on the outside of mainstream culture. I was probably maybe like 8 or so, and then I was drawing like stick figures, and then I started adding genitals to my stick figures, and I would add the women and then I'd add the men. And so seriously, like that was like the moment I was like, yeah, this is kind of interesting. And my parents found it, and they had a discussion about it. And I was in Catholic school, of course, so I was like in a parochial school. So they saw that and they were like, what's going on here? And they didn't question me about it. They just talked about it as if like, what's he learning at that school? And it was definitely like the starting point. I remember that pretty clearly. And then I didn't really act on it, for years, and I didn't really like identify obviously until I was later past college. But yeah, those were like, that was probably the moment. I think I told my family first. No, well, sorry. I moved to LA, and LA was like Shangri-La, Freedom Land, like expression. Like LA in the 90s was what was the height of like what I thought, gay culture could be, because it was amazing. There was a West Hollywood. There were people who were out. There were artists creating, and my friends were all doing kind of exciting things, and so I was a part of that. So I had to leave what I knew to find out who I was. And so yeah, I think LA was fascinating that way, and I really appreciated having that time. It was my 20s, and of course, like that's a time when I identified, and I met friends who were out, and they took me around. They took me to bars and restaurants, and it was all part of like queer culture, and that's where I kind of think I realized like this is where I'm going to be, and I just have to like now let my family know, because my friends who were my friends who were out there, they knew me as Paul, who was a part of the LGBTQ community, and so they just kind of let me be myself, and I felt good. My coming out story was at 23. I'd already been living in LA. I left New York. I had to get away, and a lot of people have that experience of like having to leave what they know to be able to figure out what they don't know is how to live as yourself, and that's a hard thing to do, and I did it, and I'm grateful. I just took myself and I moved to LA from the Bronx right after college, and never went back home, and that was it. And I think my parents, you know, probably knew. My mom, I think moms always know. I think dads always don't want to know. So I had that experience with my parents. I sat them down. I've now been like doing really amazing work and, you know, flying around the country and filming and doing some really cool stuff, which I really appreciated. But I was able to like bring them to this fancy apartment that they'd gotten me, and I was able to sit them down, and I told my mom, hey, I need to tell you something, and you know, I'm attracted to men, and I am gay, and that's kind of how I'm going to live my life. And she, without batting an eye, she said, "You've always done what you want in your life, and it's worked out. So I guess this is no different." My dad fell asleep on the couch. So I mean, that's kind of typical. So she told him afterwards, and he never brought it up. If you're feeling like you don't have a community to be a part of, I love the internet. I think that's just kind of at this point. Then there were books that actually helped me too. Like I remember buying tons of books on like just the community and like identity and so hopefully, like, you know, in my case, like it's not everyone's case, education is like key to my understanding things and experiencing things. So I read as much as I could, and I went to like, you know, whatever group I could be a part of. But I think when you're feeling like isolated, it's really, hopefully you have at least one person you can confide in. And even if it's a secret, it's better to have that secret shared with somebody than to feel like you're carrying the burden by yourself. And I don't know, you know, like that's kind of, you know, a personal experience that at some point, like, you know, it's no longer a secret, but in the beginning it is, because only you know it. And you have to kind of find spaces where you can trust someone to carry that with you, because until you own who you are, you share that with people, and like they help you kind of carry that. So hopefully, you know, I don't know who it is, but it may not be your parents, it may not be, you know, your school, it might be somebody outside of school, but it is important to find a place to kind of put that down. If you can't, then I mean, I would say write it down and use art to express what you can't say verbally, because I know I was always drawing, I was always taking pictures, and I'm a photographer, so I think I let, you know, some of it come out in my art, clearly, even at 7. I was like expressing like I was identifying with, like, I appreciate both genders, and you know, now it's like obviously every possible iteration, but I do think getting it out of your heart and into some place else, which could be a person, it could be paper, it could be the internet, a blog, but get it out there, because it's gonna fester, you know, and you don't want that. It's a lot of fun. I mean, it's amazing. It's the expressions, the kind of the iterations of how you can identify, express, name, be who you are. It's amazing to me. I love it. That's part of what kind of drove me to fashion and drove me to kind of work in the industries that I worked in, because I feel like that was where I saw the most amount of like progression in society. And I do feel like this, you know, none of this, every single thing we're talking about that is expressed now, everything that's under the sun is not new. The words may be new, and the cultural kind of expressions and the acceptance, and definitely like that's all new. But you know, I look at photos of like these kings and queens, and you know, you look at like cultures across the globe, from India to Africa to Asia. They had expressions like this. They had this. This was a part of culture in some form or other, art or spiritual practice or whatever. And I think, you know, we just have to accept that, like, you know, it was there. We just chose to suppress it, ignore it, you know, or vilify, criminalize it. And that's really the sad part of, like, you know, what happened. So today we're in a place where we're defending it, expressing it, kind of fighting for it, and then all in the name of like just saying we're here, like we need to be identified in the mainstream culture because we're a part of it. You know, that's the part that I think is like kind of been frustrating, is that I knew men growing up in Harlem and the Bronx who identified as something other than their gender at birth and their assignment. So I think, you know, these things aren't necessarily anything new. It's just we have to kind of educate ourselves back to that point of like that it's just part of, you know, the community. And that's a beautiful thing to kind of see it now as, you know, and at my age, like to look back and be like, oh my God, like, you know, you look back like it's like Sixth Sense, like they were trans back then, like, you see, or they were gender fluid, or whatever it was, like that's kind of who they were. There just wasn't a word and an umbrella or a banner to stand under because it was being persecuted, but they were there. So in the 80s, for sure, AIDS was just a fearful specter. I mean, it was just like a dark cloud chasing a community around, and it was just awful. It was, I remember I was a teenager, and it made sex forbidden or like a death sentence. Like you really could die from it, and the ignorance and the lack of kind of information about how you would contract it or you could like carry it or pass it on, it didn't exist. And it was really where in the 80s where a lot of people, unfortunately, like didn't know, and so it created more. It was hung over our heads by the Republican Party, by the politicians as a punishment or justice of some sort, and it was awful. It was so many negative things associated with AIDS, HIV transmission, and living with it. Or not living with it, because that's what it was. You were told you would just die from it. So that was the 80s from my perspective. And the people who were fighting for funding for living with the disease, for fighting and combating and looking for research, they were again valiant, amazing. From the ACT UP AIDS community, they just really were the bold, kind of amazing folks that didn't take no for an answer and wanted to fight for the community. So it was great. That was what my AIDS experience. The 90s now became like it was. Now we had to like band together and create communities and create organizations because no one was going to do it for us. So that's where like I was a part of that in the 90s. I worked at a soup kitchen, which was in LA, called Project Angel Food, and so we would work on meals for people who were homebound living with AIDS, and that was important work and work that I just I did because I felt like I was a part of a community that needed to help others who couldn't cook, who needed social contact, who were being ostracized by their families and were otherwise too weak to take part in gay culture. So I worked in the not the kitchen but the front of house, kind of staging and delivering, and that was an amazing experience because a community came together. And Project Angel Food started in an old church, which was kind of ironic, but it was a church that allowed them to run a soup kitchen. And so we would go every Sunday, I would go every Sunday, and they worked 7 days a week to deliver meals to people who were homebound living with AIDS. And I think that was the 90s for me. That exemplified what the community did in response to a crisis, was to not give up, was to find the resources, was to make yourself available and give of your spirit and your time and just do the work, that whatever it took to kind of keep people alive, recognize that they were in a part of the community, and also fight for the legal the advocacy part of it, which was getting us funding and getting us whatever we could with disability, and making sure like it was recognized as like a disease that was affecting everybody, but to make sure it was you fought for those who couldn't fight for themselves. That was the 90s, and it was a sea change from where we were in the 80s, where it was like a scramble for what do we do, who's going to help us, and then it became we're going to help ourselves, and we're going to fight for the rights and the money and the recognition that we need. I think honestly, like it's the same as like the American culture. It's been run by like well-intentioned or not so well-intentioned like white culture, capitalist culture, and so that's to me that's like it's a problem that it's just like I heard this great thing about like racism and structural racism and institutional racism and kind of like the programming that we've all kind of received is that it's like fish don't know that they're swimming in water. Like privilege and class and the money and the accumulation generationally and the oppression that happened as a result of wanting to accumulate generationally for your own people, that's all in the air. And I think it's the same in the LGBTQ community. It's not different. So I feel like I need to see more representation in the organizations. I need to see more diversity in the boards, and the people who have the money kind of can recognize that like we're not going to change the conversation until the people who are affected by the outcomes are a part of that conversation. And so it applies to women, it applies to gender, it applies to identity, it applies to disability, it applies to so many things. I think, like, you know, my take is that it's not really, it's not just an LGBTQ story. It's an American culture story, it's an American society story, but it's really focused here because we're already marginalized, and we further marginalized because we're just inheriting the structural racism that exists everywhere else in the world. And so if we can undo that, if we can as a community recognize that, like, you know, these pride things are like, there's a Harlem Pride, there's a Black Pride, there's a, you know, now there's probably going to be some other pride. Like, but I feel like, you know, the prides that kind of came along really were like predominantly white, you know, men who were of a certain class and fighting for the way they thought of it, the rights of other men of that same class. I think that the umbrella has to get bigger and the leadership has to get diverse. To that end, I feel like once those problems are solved at the top of the food chain of, you know, what is the umbrella of like organized gay culture, it'll feed down into like the right places and change strategies and change recognition and change community kind of development. You'll see like that, you know, we need to have conversations about disability and also and trans identity and gender expression, and like that to me is like everybody needs to be at the top of that food chain, kind of bringing their experiences to the forefront of like strategies. So, you know, that's where I feel like, you know, is the biggest challenge for the LGBT community is, you know, yes, we won gay marriage and that's fantastic and I'm happy that that happened, but, you know, the work of kind of deconstructing what is like a predominantly white thinking, funded and strategically like organized community is you know, not healthy. Like, you know, I know that like people of color don't necessarily identify with like, you know, what is the gay pride kind of organizers, and it's supposed to be for everybody, but, you know, if you don't have us at the table, if you don't have us in the conversation, then, you know, it's just going to kind of reflect the values that you inherited, and I think the values have to change, have to become broader. I think the generation that's coming now is just, they don't feel the cultural pressure to adhere to like those, you know, social kind of, you know, what were social norms, and the norms are gone for them and for me too. I don't believe that there's like a one way to be a family or be yourself, and that can change, and that's okay. My favorite part about being me is I think I just continue to evolve in my ability to think and be inclusive and be expressive, and like I think I've learned how to listen to my heart and not let my intellect kind of come forth or my ego be first. So I think that's been a real life kind of changing experience, and I think that's, you know, it sounds really vague, but once you detach from your ego and you let your kind of heart lead the way, you really don't find anything but like commonalities and energy exchanges happening with people. And that's where I feel the beauty of being LGBT for me comes from, because I know that you know, I can be a more brilliant artist, a more brilliant human being, a more kind of brilliant community member by letting, you know, myself express what I'm feeling in my heart. Oh. I'm gonna smile now.